after this. We have one birthday in the room today, and our friend Rebecca over here. Okay, thank you.
Joy comes in the morning. Joy comes in the morning. Joy comes in the morning. Thank you, Jesus.
The reign of darkness now has ended in the kingdom of light, in the kingdom of light. Forever under your dominion, you're the king of my life, you're the king of my life. You reign above it all, you reign above it all, over the universe and over every heart. There is no higher name. Jesus, you reign above it all. On the cross the work was finished. God, you poured out your life just to give us new life. Now from the lips of the forgiven, hear an anthem arise, 'cause Jesus, you're alive. Oh, you reign above it all, you reign above it all, over the universe and over every heart. There is no higher name. Jesus, you reign above it all. Let all of heaven and the earth erupt in song. Sing hallelujah to the everlasting one. There is no higher name. Jesus, you reign above it all. Yes, you reign above it all. You sent the darkness running out of an empty grave. Now seated alone in glory, enthroned on the highest praise. You sent the darkness running out of an empty grave. Now seated alone in glory, enthroned on the highest praise. Come on, sing it. You sent the darkness running out of an empty grave. Now seated alone in glory, enthroned on the highest praise. You sent the darkness running
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing today? Good to see you. I want to welcome you to the Pastor's Bible Study today. And if you're joining us online, welcome. Here in the room, I want to welcome you as well. And yes, I have on my Auburn Tiger stuff because we are going to run those Boomer Sooners out of Auburn on Saturday so fast. Just watch us. Just watch us. And so far, we have not run anybody out of Auburn, but there's always a first, and I'm hoping it's going to be Saturday, so we'll see what happens. But anyway, who knows? But, all right, well, so I was looking at our calendar, and as I understand it, we have 9 more of these till we take a break for Christmas. How about that? That's kind of crazy, isn't it? So what we're going to do is it's taken us half a year to get to Exodus 21. So I'm proud of us. But over these next 9 weeks, we're going to finish the book of Exodus, okay? So we're going to cover, but the good news is the way the material is organized, I think it will make sense to do it that way. So I have charted it out and have outlined what we're going to do for these next 9 weeks so that we can actually finish the book, okay? Now, we're still in, if you look at your outline, we're still in the book of the covenant. The book of the covenant starts in Exodus 21, verse 12. You really could probably date it, put it back to Exodus 20 because of the 10 Commandments, but most scholars would tell you that the 10 Commandments are kind of the underlying laws for the book of the covenant, kind of the precursor, if you will. And then here's the explanation of how to live all this out. So, you still have in your outline just the reminder that the first 19 pages of Exodus is the story of the Exodus. Chapter 20 is where we start with the conversation about how they're going to live as the covenantal people of God. So today we're going to begin the conversation about the laws of Israel. And I just put on your outline for you that God, what's happening is, God is not just randomly setting out some legal guidelines for Israel. What he's really doing is, he's giving them an explanation of how they're supposed to live while they're in the desert, but also preparing them for the promised land. And the laws, remember, we've talked about this before, they're paradigmatic in nature. That means that typically most of the laws are paradigms. In other words, we've talked about that. You know, if you steal a person's ox, then you've got to do this. And then so the thief might say, well, I didn't steal an ox, I stole a goat. Well, the point is you can make application with common sense across the various crimes, if you will. But at the heart of all this, they're intended to help the people of God know how to both engage in their daily behavior, which will distinguish them in the ancient world, and how to observe the Sabbath and some of these other religious festivals. We're going to talk about that some today. Now, as we make our way through these laws, there are 2 types of laws that will be presented. Sometimes it's causistic law. That means it's case law. If you do this, this happens. If you do this, this happens. And then you also have what's called apodictic law, and that's command kind of law. That's God saying, if you do this right here, this particular thing, then this is the exact punishment for it. It's much more specific, and I'll walk y'all through that when we get to it, okay? Now, there's also one other thing that I need to point out when we start looking at the laws of Israel, and it's what historically scholars have called Talion law. Talion law is the law of exact retaliation. That's the word that's lexus talionis in Latin. It is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Israel's not the only one to have that kind of a statement in their law. That kind of law was found across ancient societies. However, in pagan societies, it was pretty much understood that if you were of means, you could always buy your way out of whatever you did. So that was very common in the pagan world. And so what's going to happen in the law of Israel, God is not going to allow that. He's going to set forth a higher standard. Now, I think it's important for us to know when you look at the material outside the Scripture and even the Scripture itself, we don't really have evidence either outside the Scripture or within the Scripture where this was interpreted literally. So in other words, if you gouged out the eye of another person, the judge would not gouge out your eye. In other words, this is a statement that describes the kind of justice that's going to be meted out. It's not to be taken literally. Does that make sense? They're going to have to figure out, how do you make the punishment fit the crime? It's going to be up to these judges to do that, and it's going to depend upon how serious the crime is. And so the idea is Israel is not going to allow the Israelites, if you commit some kind of serious crime that causes permanent damage in the life of another person, for you just to pay some monetary fine and then get off with the rest of your life. It's not going to happen that way. There's going to be something a little more serious that will have to be done in order for you to pay for your crime. But because we hear that phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we may have thought in our minds that that's exactly how they did it. That's not really how they did it in Israel. Okay? So with that said, let's just look at some examples of the law. We're going to try to get to all the way to 23:19 today is our goal. So let's see how we do. We'll start in chapter 21, verse 12. We ended last week with the conversation on slavery and servants. If y'all were here for that, remember that. Now we pick up the law, the causistic law that's given in the rest of this text, for the most part. Verse 12. You have verses 12 through 17, just some really challenging penalties. It's where the death penalty is just spelled out specifically. So look at verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I would designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Anyone who attacks their father and mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. So, these are capital offenses, and lets you in on what's important to God, if you will. Now, there are some interesting things that are found in this material. So, for example, in the ancient world and pagan societies, we don't really find any pagan societies that differentiate between murder and killing. In other words, if you unintentionally do something that results in the death of another human being, in most pagan societies, that person got the death penalty no matter what. So do you see the distinction in Israel? If something you do unintentionally results in the death of another person, then there's a provision made. You're still going to be punished, and God is going to provide Israel a place for those people to go and live. Now, eventually, obviously, this is anticipating life in the Promised Land. You're going to have these cities of refuge, if you will. But if you take someone's life intentionally, as this text says, and you plan to do it, then that person is to be put to death. And it's interesting how it's worded. Taken from my altar. Now, why is it worded that way? Well, in the Canaanite society, if you were guilty of some egregious crime, you could flee to a Canaanite place of worship and grab the horns of the altar and receive at least a time before they decided what to do to you, and you had sanctuary. It's fascinating, that's not in Israel's law. However, there are a couple of guys who tried it. If you remember the story with Solomon in 1 Kings 1, there's two examples where Joab and Adonijah, both of those men did that. They, 1 Kings 1, verse 50, and 1 Kings 2, verse 38, those men went to find shelter, and they went to the altar and held onto the altar, believing that Solomon would not exact justice on them because they had found sanctuary. And however, That's not a law in Israel. And so just because you flee to a sacred place, you cannot be absolved of your responsibility and your guilt. So there's no sanctuary for the person that's done this intentionally. So no matter where you find him, he's to be put to death. Does that make sense? So if you think you can run to the tabernacle once it's built and be on the outside altar that's built actually in the tabernacle, not the Holy of Holies, but the altar at the entry to the tabernacle, that's not going to give you safety. They'll come get you and put you to death. In other words, there's no spatial place of safety. Forgiveness in the Old and New Testament is relational, not spatial, if that makes sense. So no matter what you do, you're going to have to pay for your crime. And it's attacking your parents, and attacking your parents is also really connected to cursing your parents. Cursing has the idea of totally rejecting who your parents are and choosing to live your own way, and even to the point perhaps of attacking them. And even kidnapping. Even if you haven't done anything with the person you've kidnapped, all of those are capital offenses in the law. Then you have this fascinating conversation that has caused lots of challenges for scholars to try to unpack. It starts in verse 22. Provisions for pregnant women. What happens if a pregnant woman is injured? Okay, so look at verse 22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely. Now that phrase there in Hebrew is really hard to translate into English. But there is no serious injury, then the offender must be fined whatever the husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you're to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. There's that talion law. Now, trying to unpack this, y'all, is a little bit difficult, and the translators have a hard time with it. So let's just look at it. First of all, you've got a fight, a brawl that's broken out, and there happens to be an innocent pregnant woman who's an innocent bystander. And she evidently is struck in the brawl. And again, the phrase gives birth prematurely, we're not really exactly sure if that's the best way to translate it, but that's the NIV's best attempt. And then there's no serious injury. Basically, what seems to be communicated is if a woman is injured and yet she's still able in due time to bear another child, then the husband will decide what's supposed to happen to the person who did this. If in due time what they discover is that the baby dies and this woman's no longer able to have children, well then you've gone to a whole nother level. And the idea underneath it, what seems to be communicated is that life is sacred both in the womb and outside the womb. That seems to be what's underneath this. There's going to have to be some kind of payment made, some kind of recompense. It's not specifically lined out. It's going to be up to the husband and the judge to determine exactly what needs to happen. But the point is, it's honoring the life of both the child and the mother as well as the husband, if you will. And again, is that going to result in the death penalty? Well, if you look at verse 23, it could. Life for life. If it results in death, and the husband deems that that death is worthy of the offender's death, well, that's what's going to happen. So, again, sometimes this paradigmatic law means that everything is not spelled out completely for Israel. They're going to have to use some common sense and make application, if you will. Then you move to a conversation about what about the servants. Remember, we talked about these indentured servants, these sometimes referred to as slaves, and that's the way it's translated here. It's the same word all the way through the Old Testament. But remember, typically, we talked about this last week, Israel does not have any provision for capturing people and enslaving them as property without any hope of their release. You remember that from last week? Remember, every 7 years, everybody pays their debt off. And so if you have a servant who you end up, that person, you buy them, if you will, you purchase them, you purchase them for their work. For 6 years, the 7th year they have to go. So what happens if you injure one of them? You know, if someone's working for you and there is some type of injury, verse 26, it says an owner who hits a male or female slave, and I love how it's put, both of those are there in the text. So in other words, this is true for men or women. And you destroy it, then you've got to let the slave go free. If you knock out the tooth, you've got the slave go free. In other words, what's underlying this? Mistreatment of the people that you have purchased to work for you for those 6 years. If you abuse them, they're free to go. They've paid their debt off. Okay? Again, it's honoring life and the sanctity of life, and it discounts the ability to hold people as slaves for the rest of their lives and treat them however you want to. And then, of course, this is an agrarian society, so these people are going to own animals and they're going to plant crops, and so that's going to be their livelihood. So starting in verse 28, what about injuries to animals? Well, once again, it's paradigmatic law. It's just about, here are some examples, and you take this and extrapolate it out into the community as need be. So, and there's all kinds of stipulations. You know, if your bull gores somebody, then that bull's got to be put to death. But if you know that bull is a goring bull and he keeps doing it over and over and over, and he gores somebody and injures them, the bull will be put to death, and so will you. So in other words, mind your bull, okay? And then not only that, people on their own property, they do all kinds of things. They dig pits and all that kind of stuff. Well, if somebody's animal falls in that pit, you're responsible for them. So anyway, there's just, again, it's just how you're going to engage in relationships with people. Now, so when it comes to the punishment of all of this, it's going to be in the hands of the judges. So, for instance, you might say, well, all right, well, we've looked at all this, and some of this is the death penalty. Some of it is, you know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Well, the judge would have all kind of options. For example, you could be banished from the community, and you might have to just leave your farm and your property, and you may just have to go live somewhere else. That could be your punishment. You could be publicly humiliated. They could engage in some kind of corporal punishment that's monitored by the judge if they chose to do that. They could confiscate your property. All that is woven into the fabric of how these judges are going to have to decide how to mete out justice. The underlying element, y'all, that I would say that's going to distinguish Israel from the ancient world is proper and equitable justice, not revenge-based justice. So it's not just revenge, it's challenging Israel to live at a higher standard. You remember how I told y'all last week that when the first time Cindy went to that village in West Africa and the Fulani farmers' cows had gotten into the field of the Hausa farmers, and the Hausa farmers came in and killed some of those Fulani farmers. You remember me telling you that story? That's how the ancient world worked. Well, how many of the Fulani should you kill? Depends on how mad they are. It's a revenge-based justice system. Israel's going to rule that out. It's going to be equitable justice. That's what's being woven into the fabric of Israel. It's going to distinguish them from ancient people. So just like you get the distinction between somebody who's killed accidentally and somebody who's murdered intentionally. Well, those are two different things in Israel. They weren't in the ancient world. You still could exact life for life even if somebody killed somebody unintentionally. That's not true in Israel. Now you get to chapter 22, and ultimately Israel's going to leave the desert, and they're going to find their way to the promised land, and they're going to actually have property. And so beginning in Exodus 22, you've got this whole conversation about property. Now here's what's fascinating, y'all. I know it's kind of interesting in the justice system. Did you know in the Old Covenant there's no provision made for imprisonment? Which is fascinating. So that's why I put in your outline restitution versus residency. Residency is a penal system where you take the offending person and place them in a residential place as punishment. That's not going to exist in the Book of the Covenant. Restitution is what Israel is going to live by. So when someone offends, they're going to make restitution. They're not going to go and live residentially somewhere else. Now, why did they do that? Well, we don't know for sure, but if you just try to start unpacking it, several scholars have given us numerous reasons. So a number of commentators on the book of Exodus have come up with all kind of reasons why Israel did not adopt the residency model. For example, if you do restitution, then compensation is generous and immediate, which is very different than our system. You have someone in our system, and every society is different, and I'm going to be a little facetious, though, to make a point. Someone can do something wrong in our system, and it might be 2 years before they're ever brought to trial or you figure out what to do with them. True? That's not how it was in Israel. That's not the way this law worked. This law, the law was laid out, was restitution focused. So in other words, you'll read through all these things. If you do this, then you're going to have to pay that. And you're going to do it immediately. So it's generous and it's immediate. And then secondly, another reason that I believe that Israel did this was the offender had to personally respond to the victim. So it's a relational approach. So if you did something and you're convicted of it and the judge says you've done this, you have to go to the person you've offended and make restitution personally. You don't pay the court and the court turns around and pays them. That's not how it worked in Israel. You had to go to them directly and make recompense. Third, another advantage of this system is if you were an offender and you were truly repentant and you made restitution, you could go on and live your life. You had a future because you'd done exactly what you were required to do. And then finally, scholars have pointed out another advantage of this system was that society did not have to assume the responsibility to house all the offenders. So in other words, Israel's not going to be taxed to pay for prisons. That's not how it's going to work. They're going to figure this thing out in a much different way, and people are going to make restitution for what they've done. They're not going to get residential options, if you will. Does that make sense? Now, not every society is going to do that. The Romans aren't going to do that. The Romans are going to imprison people. And so consequently, eventually you'll get to the New Testament and you'll find people like John the Baptist thrown in prison. Well, that was a Roman institution. Now, there's a little bit of adaptation of that in the life of Israel, but it's not found in the law. The law is restitution, not residential. So what you have in this text in chapter 22 is primarily property disputes, and things that you own that somebody else decides to take from you. Now, God is going to rule that as an abomination to Him. You don't go and take things that belong to someone else. It's just not what you do. So there are all kinds of examples. Now, here's what's fascinating about it. If you look at verse 1. So whoever steals an ox, in chapter 22, an ox or a sheep, slaughters it or sells it, he's got to pay back 5 head of cattle or 4 sheep for the sheep. In other words, the restitution is generous. If you steal, you don't just pay them back 1 sheep, you got to pay 4 sheep. In other words, you got to go beyond what you took. But look at verse 2. If the thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, then the defender is guilty of bloodshed. So that means you can kill a burglar at night, you just can't kill him during the daytime. Now, why is that? Well, think about it. In the daytime, there might be reasons for people to be around your property and your home, and not only that, presumably there are other people around during the daytime that maybe you could call on. But at nighttime, there's really no reason for a person to be on somebody else's property. And if they awaken you, you're going to be alarmed and you don't have anybody else to call on and you're just defending your property. Some of that is still in our law. If you're in your home and somebody breaks in your home at night, you can exert an immediate decision to view that as a capital offense. And you're not guilty of bloodshed. If you're under threat and there's someone else in your home, you can engage them as you choose based upon how you perceive the threat to be. Well, Israel was the same way, but during the daytime, you weren't supposed to kill them, okay? And because you'd have to stand in judgment for that. And then here's what's fascinating when you try to outline this text, and it's a little key. Whatever may happen. Look at verse 16. If you're a dad and a man seduces a virgin who's not pledged to be married, and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she has to become his wife. Now, if the father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he still has to pay the bride price for a virgin. So what's going on there? Why would this be included in the property section? Well, think about it. When families were responsible for maintaining everything that they had, a man who had a daughter, if someone was going to take that daughter from him, he was going to lose a worker in his home and not gain one. He was going to lose a worker in his home and not gain one. Because more often than not, where did they go live once they got married? They went to live at the man's family, not the woman's family. And so he's losing the potential, if you will, of income and provision for his own family. So you've got to buy her from the dad. That's how it worked. So arranged marriages were common in the ancient world. They're still common in many places in the world. What didn't exist at this time was a dowry, that the bride had to provide for the husband's family. That didn't exist in Israel. You had to pay the bride price. You had to purchase the right to have this woman as your wife. And so if you seduce her and you're not engaged to her, and now she's no longer a virgin, her value, her economic value incredibly decreases in Israel, because now your negotiation as a dad with another dad is going to be really difficult and violated because your daughter's no longer a virgin. So if you do that, you got to go ahead and pay that dad whether you marry her or not. Does that make sense? You've got to pay the money because that dad feels like he's lost what's provision for his family. And some of it is in protection for everybody. It's also, though, y'all, a sign of God's view about the sanctity of marriage. Marriage is to be done in a certain way. It was prescribed in the law, and if you violated it, that meant that you didn't really value marriage. And so there's provision. You got to go back and tell your dad, not only did I not trust you to negotiate the relationship that we're supposed to be trusted because of the value and sanctity of marriage, I've gone and done this on my own, and now he won't let me have her, and we still got to pay him. So just imagine how that conversation is going to go. It's protection for everybody. It sounds a little foreign to our ears. I get it. These are ancient times, okay? Then you have just what some scholars just call categorical imperatives. Exodus 22, starting in verse 18 and going through 23:9. It's just all kinds of laws, all kinds of situations. Once again, you get some capital offenses. Verse 18, don't allow a sorceress to live. Verse 19, if you have sexual relations with an animal, you're put to death. If you sacrifice to a god other than the Lord, you're put to death. All three of those are an abomination to God because they're an indictment on God's plan for humanity and the way they're to worship Him. A sorceress is someone who's going to threaten other Israelites and draw them in to her evil, demonic ways. She has to go. Bestiality was heavily tied to Canaanite worship practices and their fertility gods. So it's not just bestiality itself, it's the fact that this was a sign that you are an idol worshiper. And certainly if you make a sacrifice to another god, you're an idol worshiper. And God just says all three of those have to go because they have the potential to bring other people along with them. And God says we're not going to do that. They're all to be put to death. Then, verse 21, what about foreigners who choose to join Israel? Well, just remember, God says you were a foreigner one time. So you be kind to the foreigners and allow them a passageway into the life of Israel. Verse 22, be careful how you treat widows and orphans. He says if they cry out because you're not taking care of them, he says you need to know that you may find yourself in the same boat. In other words, the Lord looks after the orphan and the widows, and Israel is supposed to as well. Verse 25, provisions are made for lending money. The Lord just didn't want you charging interest to your fellow Israelites. This is your family. And so if somebody's having a hard time, that's fine. Y'all care for each other. And now what's interesting is, though, when you get to this text, I want you to notice how the pronouns change a little bit, and the Lord starts saying things like, if you do this and you do that. That's where, as I've put in your outline, you're in a little different legal code because that second person is used with specific instructions, okay? Scholars refer to that as apodictic law. God just saying, you do this and I'm going to do this to you. Okay? And then, how is Israel supposed to treat the Sabbath when they finally get their way into the promised land? They've been told to honor the Sabbath. What does that mean? Remember the Sabbath. What does that mean? Well, you've got the Sabbath. I'm sorry, I didn't put the scripture reference here, but starting in chapter 23, verse 10, and going through chapter 23, verse 19, that's the Sabbaths and the religious festivals. Here's how you're supposed to observe the Sabbath. That starts in verse 10. 6 years sow your fields, harvest the crops. 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what's left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. You're letting the land rest. What many of these farmers wouldn't have known is that's actually good for the land. But they wouldn't have known that, but they will find that out in due time. But it's symbolic, if you will, of them observing the Sabbath. And then verse 12, you can work 6 days, and on the 7th day, do no work. And not even your slaves and the foreigners. Give everybody that time. And he says, be careful, because here's what I know. If you look at verse 13, do everything I've said to you. Don't invoke the names of other gods. Don't let them be heard on your lips. Because what's going to happen is when they get in the promised land, people are going to not understand why Israel lives like this. Why do they keep the Sabbath? Why do they keep all these laws? Why won't you do what our gods lead us to do? And it's going to be very challenging for them. And then beginning in verse 14 and going through verse 19, God says, okay, 3 times a year you're going to honor me in a special way. There are going to be 3 feasts: the feast of the unleavened bread, the feast of the harvest, the feast of the ingathering. So that's going to be the Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of the Tabernacles. God's going to weave that into Israel's seasonal life. And what's happening is, y'all, is the Lord is weaving into Israel's calendar just a rhythmic response to Him of gratitude and appreciation and thanksgiving. And so their calendar is going to be built, their year is going to be built around a religious calendar so that they will pay attention throughout the year to what God has done for them. And He will give us many more instructions about all these later on. But this just sets these 3 in place. You get to the New Testament, and you'll find Jesus observing these. You'll find Jesus in Jerusalem at the various times that are listed in the life of Israel. He was a Jew, so it wouldn't be uncommon for Jesus to be there during the Feast of the Tabernacles or the Feast of the Harvest or the Passover. Those are all going to be a part of His annual rhythm, just like it would have been for any Jew, and it all dates back to the Exodus. So what's happening is God is beginning to place in the life of Israel His expectations from them so that they can live as the people of God among all these pagan people that they're going to be surrounded by. And He gives them enough specificity to where it makes sense and enough flexibility to apply it across the board as they need to. And so it's going to be a huge judicial system that's going to require organization and judges and those who are going to be responsible for exacting this judgment. But they're going to have enough guidelines for it to make sense. And it will distinguish them from the ancient peoples of the world based upon what we know about the legal system that was already in place and is going to develop all around them. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you that are online, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.